Welcome to Crisis and Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world one book at a time.
Today, we are attempting one of the most difficult deep dives imaginable, an objective, systemic analysis of the Central Intelligence Agency.
Right.
We're focusing on its bureaucratic structure, its internal culture, and really how institutional incentives can dictate power and, well, lead to chronic failure.
That immediately highlights the inherent paradox, doesn't it? I mean, the public conversation about intelligence agencies is almost always trapped between two extremes. On one side, you have the impenetrable veil of secrecy, the stuff we're just told we can't know. And then on the other, we only ever talk about it through these isolated, spectacular scandals.
Right. Coups, assassinations.
Exactly. Or the glossy, completely fictional James Bond fantasy.
Precisely. And our mission today is to deliberately cut through both of those things, the glamour and the omission. We want to look past the myths and the fear and actually treat the CIA as a complex institution.
Like a massive bureaucracy.
A massive bureaucracy. We're examining how its internal rules, its culture, and the career incentives it offers dictated outcomes for decades, often resulting in systemic failures that had, frankly, catastrophic geopolitical consequences.
So we're looking at the institutional architecture. The plumbing, the structural flaws.
Yes.
Rather than just the big explosions that make the headlines. And crucially, we're using sources that are fundamentally critical of that structure.
That's the key. They argue that the CIA's problems are not about a few isolated failures or a handful of bad apples. It's about deep, baked-in institutional deficiencies.
And to do that, we've brought together two monumental works of institutional critique.
We have. First, The CIA and the Cult of Intelligence by Victor Marchetti and John D. Marks. And second, the sprawling, comprehensive history, Legacy of Ashes, The History of the CIA by Tim Weiner.
Reading them together is fascinating. It gives you both the insider's view of the internal psychology and, the macro historian's view of the institutional trajectory.
They complement each other perfectly.
Okay, let's unpack the context of these books, because it's absolutely essential to understanding the material, particularly around transparency and institutional resistance. The CIA and the Cult of Intelligence is a truly foundational text, and its very existence is a testament to the obstacles it documents.
Well, Victor Marchetti was a serious insider. I mean, he wasn't just some disgruntled employee. He joined the CIA in 1955 and served for 14 years, rising through the ranks as a Soviet military specialist. And this is the critical part. He reached a position of immense power.
Right.
He eventually became the executive assistant to the deputy director of the agency before he finally left in 1969.
That is about as close as you can possibly get to the center of power, the nerve center of analysis and operations, without being the director himself. He saw how the sausage was made.
He really did. And his co-author, John D. Marks, also had serious government experience, but from the State Department. He worked as an analyst.
So a slightly different perspective.
A different but equally valuable one. Marx witnessed firsthand the problematic, sort of self-justifying reasoning and the chronic waste and inefficiency that drove U.S. policy in Indochina.
He saw the consequences.
He saw the flawed logic that led to the invasion of Cambodia. So he had this outsider's view on the practical, on-the-ground consequences of the agency's actions.
So the book itself, then, became a legal landmark. And this was precisely because of Marchetti's intimate insider status and the secrecy agreement he had to sign.
Exactly. When he finished the manuscript, he was required to submit it to the CIA for pre-publication review.
And their reaction was predictable.
To say the least. They initially ordered a staggering, almost comical number of redactions. 339 passages were slated for deletion.
339. That's not just editing. That's institutional obliteration.
Yeah.
You're basically demanding the complete censorship of his entire analysis.
It was an immense effort to suppress the core of the work. But Marchetti and his publishers, they pushed back, and the resulting legal battle went on for years.
And the governance argument was very specific, wasn't it?
It was, and very clever. They framed the litigation not as a First Amendment issue about free speech, which would have been a difficult battle for them to win.
Of course.
Instead, they framed it as a simple contractual matter.
Just business.
Just business. Marchetti signed a secrecy agreement, and the government was merely enforcing that contract.
That framing contractual enforcement rather than constitutional censorship allowed the institution to maintain its power and avoid a potentially damaging Supreme Court precedent about what it could classify.
That's it, exactly. And even after all that litigation, 168 passages remain deleted in the published version. The blank spaces in the original book, they literally demonstrated the institutional effort to suppress certain facts.
So the act of censorship became the primary exhibit supporting the book's thesis.
The ultimate validation. The institutional attempt to silence the critique inadvertently proved the critique's central premise about secrecy and self-protection. It's incredible. Now, contrasting this intense, insider-driven critique, we have Tim Weiner's legacy of ashes.
Weiner provides the essential macro-historical context. I mean, his work is just staggering. It's based on decades of declassified government records.
I'm talking thousands of documents.
Over 50,000 documents released through the Freedom of Information Act, plus hundreds of interviews, including 10 directors of Central Intelligence.
Wow.
That level of source depth allowed him to trace the institutional trajectory across more than 6 decades.
What's so fascinating is that both of these critiques, despite coming from different eras and methodologies, one, an insider's psychological profile, the other, a historical sweep, they share a core, devastating thesis.
They really do. The overarching argument that unites them is that the CIA rapidly, almost immediately, drifted from its original intended purpose.
Which was what, exactly?
It was supposed to be purely intelligence gathering, coordination, and objective analysis. Instead, it shifted toward paramilitary covert action, extreme secrecy, and aggressive institutional self-protection. So the moment of creation was also the moment of corruption, in a systemic sense.
Yes. And the sources argue this drift fundamentally produced systemic failure rather than strategic insight. Weiner makes the sobering observation that nearly every director of Central Intelligence left the agency in worse shape than they found it.
Wow.
Often demonstrating an institutional inability to actually understand the world or to predict major geopolitical shifts.
It's a tragic story of a bureaucratic identity crisis. It's like being handed a magnificent state-of-the-art radar dish designed to map the world, and you immediately convert it into a crude but powerful lever to start pushing things around.
That is a perfect analogy, and that contrast between the original vision and the reality is critical. President Harry S. Truman, who signed the National Security Act of 1947, he intended it to be a sophisticated global news service.
Just analysis.
A purely analytical center to keep the president informed. He was so explicit about it, famously stating it was not intended as a cloak and dagger outfit.
But the old guard, the veterans from the Wartime Office of Strategic Services, the OSS.
The Dulles brothers, Donovan?
Right. Men like William Wild Bill Donovan and Ellen Dulles, they saw a vacuum opening up after World War II. They saw the collapse of the British Empire, which had long run these sophisticated secret services.
And they believed their new American Secret Service should take up that mantle of global leadership.
So they lobbied for more power.
They actively lobbied Congress and the White House for the power to conduct covert operations. They argued that information alone wasn't enough. The U.S. needed an instrument of decisive, hidden action.
And that set the stage for the entire institutional drift.
Yeah.
Away from analysis and coordination, the job Truman gave them, toward intervention, the job Dulles and his cohort really wanted.
That's the core conflict.
Okay, let's dive into the structural defects identified by these authors. I think we have to start with the internal psychology that justified this shift, what Marchetti and Marx called the cult of intelligence.
Right. This cult is not an analytical discipline, it's a profound internal belief system. It encourages the admiration, even the veneration, of the mysterious and magical aspects of the clandestine profession.
The mystique.
The mystique. It leads both those inside the agency and the public, who are, fed by Hollywood myths, to believe fictionalized or greatly exaggerated successes over the complex, often messy, and frequently disastrous real-world facts.
So it's about prioritizing the idea of the spy, the glamorous hidden operative, over the painstaking, often tedious work of the analyst sitting in a windowless room translating documents.
Exactly. It's the assumption that secrecy inherently equals competence.
And that belief system feeds directly into the agency's core structural flaw, this shift from analysis to action.
It does. The CIA became the central instrument of covert intervention, which, by its very design, created a fatal built-in conflict of interest within the system.
Okay, how does that system conflict operate in practice?
Well, it's essentially a closed loop. The CIA drafts the intervention plans. It is the only body with the specific classified knowledge to evaluate the merits and feasibility of those plans.
So they're marking their own homework.
They're marking their own homework, and then the CIA is the action arm that executes them once the White House approves.
So the people recommending the action are also the ones guaranteeing its success and ultimately grading its performance. There's no external objective audit built into that structure to halt a poorly conceived plan.
None. And this structural bias means that if the CIA has existing assets in place, say money to fund a friendly political party in Italy or a paramilitary force in Southeast Asia,
The tools are just sitting there.
the temptation to recommend covert intervention becomes almost irresistible to top officials who have invested their careers and institutional reputation in maintaining those assets.
It's the availability heuristic, but for global politics. Why bother with the messy, complex, and slow work of diplomacy, or allow geopolitical events to follow their natural course?
Right.
When you have this secret, decisive mechanism just sitting there ready to go.
And this preference for action, tragically, had massive historical consequences, particularly throughout the Cold War. Weiner meticulously documents how the agency, driven by this intense anti-communism, gradually associated itself with protecting vested interests and the existing status quo in non-communist countries.
Can you give us a specific example of what that looked like on the ground?
Oh, absolutely. Think about the 1953 overthrow of Prime Minister Mossadegh in Iran, which was orchestrated largely to protect British and American oil interests.
Okay.
Or the 1954 intervention in Guatemala against President Arbenz, who was pursuing agrarian reforms that threatened the United Fruit Company's holdings.
So in these cases, the agency was choosing sides in legitimate internal political struggles.
Exactly, aligning itself with often repressive regimes and established economic power structures.
So instead of being a neutral observer or even, promoting democratic principles, the CIA became, in the view of much of the world, a symbol of repression.
It was actively working against legitimate social and political change.
And those quick victories they achieved, the quiet removal of a leader, often came back to bite them.
Oh, they were Pyrrhic victories. They left behind this toxic, deep-seated legacy of anti-Americanism and instability that would haunt U.S. foreign policy for decades. It proved that the quick fix of covert action was structurally incapable of delivering genuine long-term strategic success.
The institutional culture rewarded the immediate action, but it never paid the price for the long-term consequence.
Never.
So if we move from that consequence, what does the source material say was the primary tool that enabled all these actions to happen without accountability?
Secrecy.
Secrecy. We assume it's about protecting operations from the enemy. But the sources suggest a far more fundamental and frankly insidious use of secrecy within the U.S. system itself.
They argue that in the U.S. context, secrecy is equally designed, maybe even primarily designed, to keep the Congress and the public from learning what their government is doing.
The whole intelligence establishment relies on operating covertly to maintain maximum freedom of action.
And to avoid meaningful accountability. It gives the intelligence establishment what the sources describe as the right to lie to elected officials and the public, all justified under the umbrella of national security.
But the paradox is that during the Cold War, the principal targets, the Soviets and the Chinese, they often knew what was going on.
Oh, they employed highly professional intelligence services and sophisticated technical collection. They often knew exactly what the U.S. was doing, where the U-2 overflights were going. The secrets weren't secret from them.
And yet the core myth persists. The idea that the success of the agency rests on the clandestine human spy, the lone operator.
And the sources are blunt about this. Against principal targets like the Soviet Union and Communist China, the success of classical espionage human spy networks, agents in place, was virtually nil.
That is a shocking statement. I mean, the entire institutional identity, the cult of intelligence, is built around this clandestine mystique.
But the most valuable, accurate, and voluminous information came from other places. Technical collection satellites, code breaking, signals intelligence run primarily by the NSA, and, incredibly, from open sources like the foreign press, academic reports, and diplomatic channels.
So the stuff that wasn't secret at all.
A lot of it, yes. But the CIA's internal power structure, its budget, and its institutional prestige rely heavily on the careful mythologizing and glorification of the clandestine, covert work, regardless of its true efficacy.
So if technical intelligence was providing, say, 85% of the value, why did the institutional structure continue to prioritize and reward the low success rate of human espionage? Was it purely about the cult of intelligence?
It was about power and control. Let's look at the numbers cited by Marchetti and Marx around 1974. The CIA's annual budget was about $750 million.
Which sounds as a lot.
It is, but it was only about 15% of the total intelligence community budget, which exceeded $6.2 billion.
Wow. Where is the rest of that money going?
The vast majority of those resources, that 85%, were dedicated to massive technical collection, primarily run by Department of Defense agencies like the NSA and Air Force Intelligence.
So the Director of Central Intelligence, the DCI, the head of the CIA, was the titular chief of the entire community, supposedly coordinating all that. But he directly controlled only a tiny fraction of the budget.
Exactly. So if the DCI was the titular head, but the DoD controlled 85% of the money, how did the DCI exert any real power?
Through the glamour of covert action.
Precisely. The DCI's actual power stemmed not from controlling the biggest budget, but from controlling the glamorous, sensitive, and politically attractive secret activities, the very things Congress chose to ignore or were afraid to question.
And that brings us to Congress, which the critiques depict as spectacularly passive.
Absolutely. The sources argue Congress utterly failed to exercise meaningful control. The very word intelligence seemed to make legislators just bow and genuflect.
So they gave him a blank check.
Virtual blank checks. They preferred to remain in the dark about politically sensitive covert operations unless the CIA could boast about a clean, quiet success. There's an example about black propaganda efforts against mainland China in 1967, which were briefed to Congress only because they were considered a successful bragging point.
So it sounds like Congress deliberately created a system of willful ignorance. It ensured they had plausible deniability if things went wrong,
while benefiting politically if things went right. That's the core conclusion of the critique. The systemic failure of oversight allowed the culture of secrecy to become self-justifying and self-expanding,
which ensured that internal mistakes and low success rates were shielded from any necessary external review.
Yes.
Now let's talk about the final core defect. How this cult of secrecy in action fosters systemic inaccuracy and the brutal suppression of dissent internally. It starts with just too much information.
The problem was never a lack of data, it was drowning in it. A crucial 1967 internal review by Hugh Cunningham concluded starkly that the United States intelligence community collects too much information.
Wow.
This massive duplication, often collection for collection's sake, just clogged the entire analytical system. It made it incredibly difficult for analysts to separate the truly important signals from the overwhelming noise.
The definition of information overload leading to analysis paralysis. If everything's important, nothing is important. But even when analysts did manage to find clarity, bureaucratic incentives often trumped that accuracy.
Oh, absolutely. We see a stubborn, expensive reluctance to terminate programs, even when they were proven obsolete or actively embarrassing.
How so?
Well, the military intelligence arms had spent billions developing spy planes and ships, and they were institutionally reluctant to take those collectors out of service because it would mean admitting the vast expenditure was now unnecessary.
Can you give us a concrete example of that bureaucratic stubbornness?
Certainly. After satellite imagery made overflights of the Soviet Union largely moot, for example, drone flights over China continued even though they were frequently being shot down,
creating embarrassing international incidents.
Right, and yielding very little useful data. Similarly, Air Force SR-71 Blackbird flights continued over North Korea despite a lack of meaningful intelligence targets there, simply to justify the operational need for the aircraft.
So the momentum of the bureaucracy kept marginal programs alive simply for institutional self-preservation. And this self-protection also extended to actively punishing internal critics and burying reports of catastrophic failure.
This is where the critique gets truly disturbing. When the Bay of Pigs operation failed disastrously in 1961, DCI Allen Dulles' deputy, General Cabell, warned him about the internal review of the disaster, the Kirkpatrick Report.
What did he say?
He said that if this report fell into unfriendly hands, it would destroy the agency because of its devastating criticism of the operation's planning and execution.
And what was the institutional response to this document of accountability?
Dulles agreed that the truth would be too damaging. They ordered 19 of the 20 printed copies of the Kirkpatrick Report to be recalled and literally destroyed.
They destroyed that?
Only one copy was ever officially preserved. That is a clear, institutional, high-level decision to actively prevent organizational learning from catastrophe just to protect the agency's reputation.
Imagine being one of those analysts. Seeing that comprehensive review of failure, knowing it was the only real document of accountability, and then watching them destroy 19 of the 20 copies, that must have been just soul-crushing.
It creates a culture where honesty is penalized. And this pattern of suppression continued through the decades. Richard Helms, who was DCI under Johnson and Nixon, went to extraordinary lengths to bury past mistakes.
What do you do?
The sources reveal he actively withheld information about the agency's Castro assassination plots from the Warren Commission investigating the Kennedy assassination.
Why hide something so vital to a major national investigation?
An investigator testified years later that Helms withheld the information because disclosing that the CIA was actively plotting to kill Castro at the very moment Kennedy was killed would have been politically fatal.
It would have cost him his job.
It would have been deemed a morally reprehensible act that would have cost Helms his job, but it was also, critically, an absolutely vital factor for the commission to analyze. This shows personal and institutional survival overriding national historical truth and justice.
That brings us perfectly to the institutional mechanics. Let's map the CIA as a structure and identify the key actors and how their conflicting incentives drive this systemic failure.
Okay. We have several key players. First, the leadership and operators, the DCI and the clandestine services. Their inclination was always toward operational success, action, and maintaining that institutional mystique.
The cloak and dagger types.
Exactly. Men like Richard Helms or Richard Bissell, who had the unique role of simultaneously planning, executing, and advocating for the covert operations he himself pushed for, like the U-2 program and the Bay of Pigs.
Their incentive is clear. Action validates their existence and justifies their budget. Then you have the analysts and the intelligence directorate.
The analysts were often the pessimists, the ones who collected and processed the data, and they struggled constantly to be heard, especially when their findings contradicted the prevailing political or operational winds.
And the classic example you mentioned was the prelude to the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962.
Yes. A small, specialized group of CIA analysts became convinced, against all conventional wisdom, that an unprecedented Soviet military buildup was happening in Cuba. They used a specialized technique known as crateology.
Crateology. Let's unpack that. What exactly is it?
It was the meticulous, painstaking analysis of the packing crates and shipping manifests observed on Soviet vessels arriving in Cuba. It was the ability to look at the size, shape, stenciling on the crates.
The mundane details.
And accurately deduce the highly sensitive military contents within, specifically that they were sheltering medium-range ballistic missiles.
So it wasn't the sexy spy stealing a blueprint. It was hyper-detailed analytical work driving the critical intelligence.
Precisely. But even this critical, accurate warning was initially hampered and countered by military intelligence agencies like the DIA and NSA, which dismissed the activity as mostly innocuous.
The primary consumers of this flawed system are, of course, the presidents and the White House. They're the ultimate directors of action, but they also frequently reject analysis they don't like.
The Nixon White House is a prime example. Nixon and Henry Kissinger harbored immense distrust of the established intelligence community. They disbelieved much of the expert CIA analysis regarding Soviet strategic capabilities.
They thought the agency was too soft.
Too liberal or too complacent. And the consequence of that political pressure was institutional failure. The pressure on analysts to align with political demand was so pervasive that for 13 years, from Nixon onward,
13 years,
every single intelligence estimate of Soviet strategic nuclear forces overstated the rate at which Moscow was modernizing. Political alignment actively trumped objective accuracy, costing billions in unnecessary defense spending.
Finally, we map Congress, who, as we established, were the silent partners in this failure.
Largely passive. They allowed the DCI to act as a kind of sacred shibboleth, granting virtual blank checks and preferring to rely on the director's word rather than exercising any meaningful control.
The internal culture and incentives of the agency reflect this narrow operational focus. We see an emphasis on institutional survival and self-protection that borders on arrogance.
It manifests in small but telling ways, like the clandestine services resisting returning proprietary profits from selling off a CIA-owned airline back to the Treasury.
Why?
Because the idea of explaining and justifying such a financial transaction to mere bookkeepers went against the entire clandestine mentality of operating above scrutiny.
That resistance to transparency, even over standard financial accounting, perfectly illustrates the cult of intelligence in action. We are special. We are not subject to standard rules.
And this institutional arrogance was reflected in recruitment practices, which limited the agency's vision. The sources detailed that the agency was notoriously slow to adopt equal opportunity. It remained a bastion of WASP power.
The old boys club.
Very much so. The clandestine services often recruited from a very narrow, highly connected background, the Ivy League, Council on Foreign Relations connections.
Which reinforces groupthink and limits the diversity of perspective you need to analyze a complex, diverse world.
Richard Bissell, the key operator behind the Bay of Pigs, openly admitted that this homogeneity was threatening the agency's capabilities. If everyone thinks the same way, your ability to understand diverse geopolitical movements is severely hampered.
There was also a level of financial gamesmanship that other government departments just wouldn't touch.
Oh, the sources detail the agency playing fiscal games that other government departments would not dare engage in. This included using employee retirement funds and credit union capital to play the stock market, all supervised in secret by senior agency officers. This level of financial maneuvering just underscores the belief within the agency that its operations were somehow above the law, justified by the necessity of secrecy.
The belief system, the narrow recruitment, the financial maneuvering, it all contributed to the agency's ability to maintain an opaque identity, even down to the mundane details of daily cover.
Clandestine service employees were masters of the vague cover story. Around Washington, they'd claim to work at state or defense, but be extremely vague on the details. And the phone numbers they provided, though traceable to the correct exchange for the cover organization, were, through some deft wiring, routed straight to Langley headquarters. A simple, elegant system designed to maintain plausible deniability.
It's a beautifully complex system designed to maintain an opaque identity. And the ultimate outcome of these clashing incentives, the analysts versus the operators, Congress versus accountability, is a disastrous, decades-long feedback loop that institutionalizes failure.
We can trace this loop directly. It starts with secrecy, which leads to a lack of oversight and accountability. Congress bows to the director. This lack of oversight allows for operational failure catastrophes like the Bay of Pigs or the costly paramilitary missions into Korea and Vietnam.
But instead of admitting fault or undergoing reform, that operational failure leads to increased secrecy.
Exactly. Destroying reports, like the Kirkpatrick Review, to protect the agency's reputation, budget, and institutional image.
And increased secrecy leads to a profound loss of outside perspective and critical analysis,
which results in systemic inaccuracy, the chronic, repeated failure to predict major events.
And the examples are staggering. The failure to warn of the Soviet nuclear test, the inability to accurately assess North Korean military intentions,
the complete surprise of the Yom Kippur War, the unexpected nature of India's nuclear test, and the shocking failure to predict the collapse of the Soviet Union.
The list is tragically long. The structure was so oriented toward action and self-protection that it lost its primary function of objective analysis.
Tim Weiner summarizes this pattern devastatingly when discussing the lead-up to the Iraq War. The system was so divorced from reality that President George W. Bush publicly dismissed them, stating they were just guessing about the course of the war.
The structure was designed to fail epically and then to repeat the failure. It's clear that this historical pattern has major, chilling implications for the present day. Let's start with the inevitable result: pervasive public distrust.
Right. The sources highlight that the historical pattern of secrecy, primarily designed to shield actions from scrutiny, naturally fosters profound generational distrust. When you have an institution with a history of documented manipulation,
like psychological warfare in Guatemala,
or funding foreign politicians, or secretly intercepting conversations, it generates a very specific, reasonable fear.
A fear that manipulation directed abroad could ultimately be turned inward.
Exactly. The institutional ability and precedent for conducting psychological warfare, for disseminating propaganda, is established fact within these sources. And this raises the reasonable fear that if the institutional capacity exists and is deployed globally, there's little structural reason to believe it couldn't eventually be used against U.S. citizens to manage perception.
And this historical tension between analysis and the action imperative explains precisely why intelligence failures repeat across decades. The political utility of a lie overrides the simple institutional need for truth.
We talked about the 13 years of overstating Soviet nuclear forces. That wasn't a one-off error. That was 13 years of analysis being politically massaged to fit a desired narrative that justified massive defense spending.
The most disastrous recent example that follows this pattern is the lead-up to the Iraq invasion in 2003.
Absolutely. The CIA, under immense political pressure to confirm administration assumptions about weapons of mass destruction, produced what one source termed a ton of analysis from an ounce of intelligence. They were synthesizing and exaggerating weak or non-existent intelligence to meet a clear political demand for action.
The individual circumstances change, but the institutional mechanism for failure remains constant. Political alignment and incentive trump investigative rigor and accuracy. The system rewards those who provide the politically useful answer, not the truthful one.
And this creates a knowledge vacuum. Because these institutions are so complex, so shielded by classification, and so distrusted, they functionally prevent the public from understanding how power actually works. And nature, particularly the human drive for knowledge, abhors a vacuum.
That institutional opacity compels the public to seek information through parallel education systems. When official narratives are distrusted or incomplete, people turn to informal networks.
And we see this explicitly today, where contemporary voices are recommending deep cuts to institutional history books that analyze systemic manipulation, like the Jakarta method in alternative social media spaces like TikTok.
That's a fascinating modern reflection of the historical problem. Marchetti and Marx faced litigation and censorship in the 70s for trying to pierce the veil of secrecy. Now, the public is independently seeking out the very systemic critique the government tried to suppress 50 years ago.
This phenomenon, individuals using alternative channels to seek out uncensored, systemic understanding, underscores the deep public hunger for knowledge that exists outside the official, filtered narrative.
And the efforts of Marchetti, Marx, and historians like Weiner highlight the ongoing crucial necessity for independent scrutiny to compel these powerful institutions toward even minimal transparency.
Absolutely.
Let's step back now and connect this deep dive to the larger themes we explore here on crisis and perception. The CIA's history is a definitive case study in how systems are engineered to reward loyalty over truth.
It is a consistent, tragic thread. The system consistently rewards those who align with the political goals, the covert operators focused on intervention, the ones who deliver the optimistic, can-do spirit regardless of the risk or the lack of evidence.
And conversely, the system actively suppresses the pessimistic, objective analysts, the ones who predicted the disaster in Vietnam, the ones who accurately spotted the Cuban missiles,
or the ones who struggled against the overhyping of Soviet military strength. Their institutional honesty was a direct threat to political objectives, to Pentagon budgets, and to the agency's own operational prestige.
The internal culture, by treating critics as threats, destroying the Kirkpatrick report, ignoring pessimistic estimates, actively inhibits necessary feedback loops.
And when you eliminate the capacity for self-correction, you guarantee that failures will be repeated, not learned from.
Another theme that permeates this history is the use of sheer complexity as camouflage, power hiding behind complexity. The sources detail the scale and fragmentation of the intelligence community as a deliberate shield.
We are talking about an intentionally created, interlocking, overlapping maze of organizations. By 1974, that massive $6.2 billion budget was spread across the CIA, NSA, DIA, and various specialized military intelligence arms.
This institutional size, combined with the extreme technical compartmentalization, makes it virtually impossible for outside bodies, and often even the DCI himself, to evaluate the programs as a cohesive whole.
And that complexity acts as a powerful deterrent to reform. Congress looks at that massive budget and just assumes everything is running efficiently because it's too complex to dissect.
And Helms rarely challenged the Pentagon on their technical collection systems, even when they were redundant.
Right, simply because he lacked the institutional power, the time, and the complete understanding necessary to tell a massive Defense Department agency to cut back on a billion-dollar program. The complexity preserves the budget.
But the greatest, most devastating consequence of all this is the eventual loss of epistemic contact with reality. The institutional inability to accurately grasp the world it's supposed to be analyzing.
When the internal incentive structure rewards action, political utility, and minimizes critical self-review, the institution loses its grip on objective truth. Marchetti and Marx fundamentally argue that the problem is not a lack of effort, but a structural reward system that prioritizes action and self-preservation over the primary mission of providing objective truth.
Which is why the failure to predict major events became the agency's defining characteristic. the Cuban missiles in '62, the Yom Kippur War in '73, or even the breakdown of communication leading up to 9/11.
It was plagued by volumetric intelligence and a lack of integrated analysis. It all stems from a system that prioritized its operational capabilities and self-protection over rigorous objective analysis.
The cumulative lesson is that the system, in its earliest structural decisions, was often fundamentally incapable of performing the primary job Truman assigned it, being an objective, sophisticated center for intelligence coordination. In summary, this deep dive shows that both Marchetti and Marx in the '70s and Tim Weiner, looking back over history, framed the CIA not as a collection of isolated heroes or villains, but as a rigid, powerful, bureaucratic system.
A structure that, since its earliest days, prioritized the power of covert action, the glamour of the clandestine, and aggressive institutional secrecy over its mandated role of rigorous, objective analysis and coordination.
And the core corrosive element here is excessive secrecy.
It corrodes necessary feedback loops. It inhibits institutional learning from catastrophic errors like the Bay of Pigs, Vietnam, Iraq. And it allows systemic failures to repeat across decades, largely independent of who holds the directorship at any given time.
This lack of transparency makes the system far less responsive and accountable than is necessary in a democracy. So what does this all mean for you, the listener? If intelligence gathering is a vital service that must operate under some veil of classification, but the system designed to execute it is fundamentally structured to reward action, protect itself, and resist external accountability, which, by these accounts, it has done since the 1940s, then what mechanisms outside of slow, often politically charged congressional inquiries are truly effective in maintaining accountability in a democracy where power hides behind the veil of classification?
That is the ultimate crisis in perception we are left to confront.
This deep dive into the system of intelligence was based on the critical works of Victor Marchetti, John D. Marks, and Tim Weiner. We strongly encourage you to seek out and read these works yourselves, support investigative journalists and historians, or borrow the works from your local library.
For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer link in the description.
If you enjoy systems-level analysis like this, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.